This is a lot on my screen. So if anybody logs in now, they're going to hear or see it. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Can you hear me? Does it work? We're testing out APAD. Can you guys hear anything? Yeah. Oh, I just heard you.
It sounds really good.
Does it sound good? Okay.
There's a little bit of a delay.
Okay.
Keep that in mind.
Oh, yeah. Delay. So between you and I then. It's gonna, you're not gonna know when I have problems. Yeah. You're gonna find out 2 minutes later, 30 seconds later. Okay.
I'll know right away because we're
Okay, make your
Hi, everyone. This is Rochelle Hadlin with Goodman Schwartz Public Affairs.
And this is Brandy Patron with Goodman Schwartz.
I'm going to do a couple housekeeping things here, looking at the chat. So for those of you who are logged in, who are looking at a screen where it just looks like static, you need to click View the Video on YouTube. And all of you are muted. So you'll be using the chat feature to ask questions throughout this so that we can avoid background noise. And we just started, so for those of you who couldn't hear anything, that's why. So for those of you who are on who do not have a picture yet, you do need to view this video through YouTube, and that's why you have that staticky image. Once you do that, you should have a working picture. You should be able to follow along with us throughout the presentation. We are going to give it a couple minutes here. It looks like we have about half of you on. If you are on YouTube, you should be looking at the first slide of a PowerPoint presentation, Understanding the Arizona State Legislature. Okay, it looks like everyone is getting audio now. If anyone is having problems with their picture, YouTube does adjust the bandwidth for you. So if you are using other applications, other streaming services, anything that's taking up Wi-Fi or internet, you're going to want to shut out of those things so that everything goes smoothly throughout our broadcast and our webinar today. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, be sure to type it in to the chat feature. That's real time for us so we can see your questions. And then there's a feature for you to click on that marks it as a question. So that'll pop up on my end as a question, and I'll notice it more quickly. We will get to your questions throughout the presentation in as real time as we possibly can. Okay, I'm going to put myself on mute now. If anyone has any technical difficulties, be sure to use that chat feature. We're going to give it a couple more minutes. We've got about half of the people registered on right now.
And while we're waiting for everybody to jump on, I'm going to move to this first slide of our presentation for everybody to take a look at. Read through these while we're waiting for everybody to get on, looking to see what folks think these events have in common. So I'm not seeing anybody else jump on, Rochelle. I think we'll go ahead and get started.
Hold on a second, Brandy. I'm answering some questions on the chat feature.
Okay.
Trying to make sure that if we have folks like sitting on that static screen that we get them on here too.
Thank you. I'll be back.
Okay, everybody, it looks like we were having some technical issues due to internet speed, but I think that we are ready to go. So we're going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of everybody's time. Like I said, I'm Rochelle Hadlin with Goodman Schwartz. Brandy Patron will be presenting today, and this is the first of our webinar series, Understanding the Arizona State Legislature. Today we'll be talking a little bit more about the legislative process, helping you guys get up to speed. In future webinars, we'll be going more in depth into the state budget. We will also be talking about legislative advocacy and how to get engaged. And then once elections take place, we will be going into the political realm, talking about the world as we know it once those elections are complete and we have a leadership team in place at the state capitol. We're also hoping to plan a training event at the state capitol so that folks can come. You can see committee rooms. We can practice moving around, doing the request to speak system, that type of thing. And we will have more information on all of those events very soon. So today, before we get started, want to say that Brandy and I are using this webinar service for the first time. We are anticipating, as with any new service, some hiccups, but we chose this because the visual and audio quality is supposed to be the best, and we're hoping that it is, and that we can get through things relatively quickly. Some housekeeping issues for you all before I turn it over to Brandy. A couple of things that you want to know during the webinar. YouTube automatically adjusts the bandwidth for you, so it may be that you have too much going on in the background if it's blurry for you and not adjusting appropriately. If that's the case, you're going to want to shut down any streaming services especially, or applications on your computer, anything that would take away from a Wi-Fi connection or anything that would slow your computer down. Once that's done, you are going to want to refresh your screen or close out completely and use the link provided in the email that we sent you to log back in, and that should fix any problems that you're having. If you're having more in-depth technical issues, please send a chat and I will try and address that as we go. I'll be replying to you, so please watch. I'll try to get to those in real time. all of you are muted currently. We're doing that because sometimes background information gets distracting and we are recording this webinar. So we want to make sure that the sound quality is good for anybody who watches in the future. If you do have a question, please type it into the chat feature that's located on the original screen you were on. Send it to me and mark it as a question so that I can see that you are asking a question. I'm anticipating that we might have quite a bit of traffic during the presentation, and we will try to get to your questions in real time. But if we do not, we'll certainly address any questions at the end of the presentation. So stick around for that. At the end of the presentation, you will receive an email. It will allow you to watch the replay. So if you do have to get off at any time, that's okay. You'll be able to come back and watch the entire presentation, including the answers to all of the questions at a later time. And that will be made available to all APED members as well. So with that, let me give it to Brandy. Brandy will be doing the presentation today on understanding the Arizona State Legislature.
Great, thank you, Rochelle. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, Brandy Patron with APED, and thank you all so much for joining us today. So wanted to start with this information. I know we've given most of you a few minutes here to take a look at this, but wanted to see if you all could figure out what all of these events have in common. Talking about when bars stay open, whether or not you can buy a Powerball ticket, when you get a ticket for speeding, what type of school is available for kids that's free, hunting, what you can do when you turn 16, when you get your driver's license, and then tax credits. So if you haven't guessed it already, all of these events are decided by the legislature. So your state legislature has determined all of these different details of your life or parts of your life that you might do. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that there's a lot of decisions that are made at the legislative level that directly affect us on a daily basis. And with that, I think it's important to see also that those decisions that the legislature is making really do affect developmental disabilities. So the decisions that they're making are affecting funding and services. They essentially determine the provider rates because they're determining the amount of money that is available, which then determines staffing levels and training requirements and such. And then they also determine the policy decisions. So the ABLE Act that we're going to talk about today, the legislature passed and the governor signed. A couple of years ago, we passed the Client Services Trust Fund, additional monies for that. And a couple of years ago, we also worked on some DNR rules for individuals with DD. And so all of those decisions and whether or not that was made by the legislature and ultimately the governor. So I think it's always important for us to keep that in mind as we move forward on how much the decisions that they make really do affect us personally and then professionally as well. So wanted to start with what's in the Constitution of Arizona. So the Constitution is what the Constitution of the state of Arizona, is what creates our legislature. And so it does create a bicameral legislature. You can see it talks about a legislature that consists of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Nebraska is actually the only state with a unicameral legislature, and they're also nonpartisan. So Arizona is not unique in this case. Nebraska would be the unique one. While we talk today, you're going to hear me talk a lot and use the term chamber. When I say chamber, we're talking either the Senate or the House. So I'll do my best to differentiate when we're talking Senate versus House, but the majority of the time we'll be talking about a chamber, which means it could be either side. So in Arizona, as you take a look at what's written in the Constitution, the people are only partially delegating legislative power to the state government. When you take a look at it, the Constitution reserves a lot of rights to the people of Arizona to enact or reject laws as well. So the legislature isn't the entire body that gets to do that. The people of Arizona are actually part of the legislative body. Until 1950, when the Constitution was amended, the legislature actually met every 2 years. And now we meet on an annual basis. The legislature starts in January and usually runs about 100 days. somewhere in the April-May timeframe. Although for those of you who have been around with APAD the last several years, you'll recall some very long legislative sessions as well. What I also think is really interesting is that while the United States Constitution and some other state constitutions have an implied separation of 3 branches, the framers of Arizona's Constitution actually expressly set forth the powers and the limitations of each branch, and specifically have the legislative authority, as you see here, written out in the Constitution. That's actually unique for some states. So what does the legislature do? What are its duties? So we talk a lot about enacting state laws. That's obviously one of the first things that it does. The legislature is also required to set a system of elections for our major federal, state, and local officials. They set the policy and how our elections are conducted. They propose changes to the state constitution, budgeting the state's expenses and determining financial priorities. They also audit certain state agencies and programs. The legislature on the Senate side reviews appointments of certain executive branch officials. And there's also impeachment powers for certain elected officials and judges for the legislature. And then for those of you who have been in Arizona for a little while, you'll also know that the legislature used to establish our legislative districts. And that actually changed in 2001 as a result of a ballot measure. And now we have the Independent Redistricting Commission, which is charged with that task. But prior to 2001, our legislature actually drew the districts as well. So how do you become a legislator? Well, you have to be at least 25 years of age at the time that you take office. You must be a resident of the state for at least 3 years before your election, and you must be a resident of the county from which you were elected for at least 1 year prior to that election. Interestingly, as you all know, we have 30 legislative districts. There's 1 senator and 2 representatives from each legislative district. So our legislators are no longer elected from the counties, but that county residency requirement still remains in the Constitution. So while it doesn't come into play during an election cycle, because we now have 30 legislative districts, it does come into play when a legislator needs to be replaced. So for example, if a legislator were to resign to run for a different office, then that would come into play where they have to choose whether or not, to determine whether or not they're from the county that they were qualified in.
It's gonna switch this out really quick.
So not coming across. Sorry, we're having some difficulties here. Is it working out?
Hope so.
All right, we're checking on this. Sorry, guys. Some other qualifications of legislators. They must be a qualified elector, and that's defined essentially as not under guardianship or otherwise legally incapacitated. They cannot have been convicted, that should say convicted of treason or a felony, and they may not be employed by the state or any county, city, or town, but that does not include public school teachers. So the term limits for legislators. Term limits were changed relatively recently in 1992 for our legislators. They may serve only 4 consecutive terms in their offices. They must be out of that same office for at least 1 full term before they can run again. So for example, we've had legislators that were elected to the Arizona House of Representatives. They served 4 2-year terms, so they were there for 8 years. Then they were eligible to run for the Senate because they were in a different body. You've also seen where legislators have maybe done a couple of years, 1 or 2 terms, 2 or 4 years in one body, and then moved over to a different body so as not to hit those term limits for the consecutive time frame. If they do want to come back and they don't switch bodies, they've got to sit out for a full term in order for them to come back and run again. So let's talk about the legislative process and how a bill becomes law. For those of you that grew up in Arizona, this might be a memory from 4th grade class where you got to tour the Arizona State Capitol as well. So these are the general legislative process steps. We're going to talk about each of these individually and take you through how a bill becomes law. So bills start in many different forms. Generally speaking, there are lots of different folks that can bring an idea to a legislator and ask a legislator to pass a different type of law. That could be a lobbyist representing a group or a company or an individual. That could be an individual themselves that brings an idea to a legislator. It could be a constituent, could be a friend, could be a family member, and it could be the legislator themselves. What you'll see a lot of times at the Arizona legislature is that the genesis for a lot of different bills actually started the session before, 2 years before, 4 years before. A lot of ideas take several years to pass, and so the genesis for a bill might have started at the legislature and then they work and tweak it until they get it right. But once that idea is created, and a draft essentially is created of that idea, legislative council is required to actually create the legal draft of the bill. So a legislator could go to legislative council, which is staff of the legislature, they are nonpartisan staff, and say, I have an idea that I would like to change the driving age in Arizona to 18. Legislative council would then draft that in proper form. Or a legislator could bring a draft to legislative council, and then legislative council would have to put that in proper form. Once that draft is put in proper form, legislative council turns it into what's called an introductory set, or you'll hear intro set. That intro set has the language of the bill and has a signature page for the sponsor of the bill to sign saying, yes, I would like to be the sponsor. That intro set also has the names of all the other legislators, and if they would like to sign on as sponsors, that's where they do so. So they must literally sign the bill that they would like to be a co-sponsor or a prime sponsor on that bill. That intro set is then turned into what we call the hopper. There's literally 2 baskets, one in the Senate, one in the House, that are known as the hopper. And the intro set is put into that basket, which is essentially a basket. And the secretary and the chief clerk of the House individually that are able to turn those intro sets into bills that can be introduced at the legislature. So throughout this session, we're going to be talking about the ABLE Act. This was House Bill 2388, this last legislative session, and we're going to use that as an example as we walk through the process. So the ABLE Act was drafted by a group of volunteers. APAD was a part of that. We brought a group of stakeholders together, knowing that we wanted to pass ABLE Act here in Arizona. And for those of you who may not be familiar with them, ABLE Act stands for Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, and there was federal law that passed that enabled states to individually choose whether or not they wanted to create these accounts, which are essentially savings accounts for individuals with disabilities. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you also see what was initially our starting draft. So we put together what we thought should be in there. Of course, there's no statutory references. There's no numbers on here because Legislative Council hasn't touched it yet. You'll also see there's a blank up there on top. There were decisions to be made. But this was something that we brought to ultimately Representative Allen, who ended up being our sponsor, as a starting point for the legislation. So what can a legislator introduce? Well, you hear us talk a lot about bills, and bills are the most numerous types of items that a legislator can introduce. Their subject area can be mostly about anything dealing with state law, anything in our state laws, in our Arizona revised statutes. The bills are numbered consecutively within each chamber. So Senate bills start with 1,000 and House bills start with 2,000. And the bills retain their same number throughout the session, even when they go to the opposite chamber. A legislator can also introduce a resolution. And a resolution is a declaration or an expression of legislative opinion or will or intent that's within the legislature's purview. So a simple resolution is only processed through the chamber in which it was introduced. So a simple resolution can be introduced in the Senate Resolution 1001, for example, and it expresses an opinion. It might appoint a committee, or it might express the regret on the death of a former legislator, for example. A concurrent resolution, so an SCR or an HCR, is processed through both houses and it is not signed by the governor, it could provide for the submittal of a referendum to the voters or its legislative action to amend the US or the Arizona Constitution. Then there are joint resolutions. If they're passed through both chambers and signed by the governor, then it's used to provide for temporary measures that are having the effect of law. So for example, it could be ratifying a contract that the legislature and the governor as a state have to enter into. Joint resolutions don't happen too often, but they are available as something that can be passed. And then lastly, there are memorials. Memorials are messages that are sent to an officer or an entity outside of the legislature, and it allows the legislature to petition the recipient to acknowledge stated facts and act in a manner consistent with the request. So for example, the legislature may request Congress, the President of the United States, or federal agencies to do things that the legislature has no jurisdiction to do itself. As a simple example, this last year there were some rules that were promulgated by the EPA that the legislature ultimately as a body disagreed with, and so they sent a memorial looking for Congress to take action on those rules and to stop those rules from going into place. So that could be something that the legislature asks to be done. So here is a bill, and this is again House Bill 2388. And this is what it looks like once Legislative Council has done its job to it. And this is the cover page that you will see. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the parts of the cover page because there's a lot of information on here that is used throughout the legislative session. So first you have up here at the top, you have this short title or what's called a reference title. Most of us know it by short title. Here, qualified disability expenses, eligible individuals. So this short title is used to give a brief idea of the nature of the measure, and it's also used to aid in indexing of the bill. But this short title is actually not part of the substantive law of the measure. Legislative Council has created rules for the use of a short title. It's limited to 5 or fewer words. And Legislative Council must create an accurate and inclusive description of the contents, but it cannot reflect political, promotional, or advocacy considerations. The final determination of the contents of this short or this reference title is up to the Legislative Council. So while a legislator could have an opinion on what that short title should be, ultimately Legislative Council is required to create that and approve what that language looks like. So every bill will get that short title or reference title. And here in the middle, you see our bill number. House bill, HB stands for, and we also know it's a House bill because it starts in the 2000s, so 2388 or 2388 as we usually refer to them. You'll also see here on the left-hand side, this is our legislative session information. So this came from the House of Representatives. That's another way for you to tell the originating chamber. And this bill was introduced in the 52nd legislature of the second regular session. And when the elections happen, so for example, this year we are obviously in an election year, and we will have a new legislature that is sworn in January. In January of 2017, that legislature that is sworn in will become the 53rd legislature for Arizona, and they will be working in their first regular session. So it's the first year that that new legislature is getting together. So then in 2018, the second year, so again, remember they have 2 terms. So in the second year of their term, they will still be the 53rd legislature, but they will be working in their second regular session. So that's how that's determined. And that lets you know, or if somebody was trying to find a law or a bill that maybe didn't make it through the entire process, that information helps them to find where a bill might have been going through the process, what time of year, what legislature did that happen in. And then you'll see underneath the bill number, we have our sponsors of the bill. The first sponsor here happens to be Representative John Allen, is the prime sponsor of the bill. So generally speaking, when you hear about sponsors of bills, it's usually that first name that is mentioned, but he also received several other sponsors, as you can see. And again, going back to the introduction set or the intro set, all of these legislators had to sign that cover page to say that they wanted to be a sponsor. You might see right here in the middle, there's a colon after Senator Yee's name. What that means is that all of those legislators prior to that colon also wanted to be prime sponsors. So they wanted to be super duper sponsors of the bill, and the others have signed on as co-sponsors. Really, in practical purposes, Mr. Allen is the name that comes up the most, and that's the name that you'll see when it goes up on the big board for a third reading. And so really the rest of the names are really, really great, but the first name ends up being the one that's most important. And then lastly, you'll see here down below in blue, this is known as the bill title. And I know that can be a little bit confusing, but the bill title is actually the constitutional requirement that every bill has to have. And this is actually the legal information that is required to be on the bill. While the rest of that information is informative and is important, what you see in blue is actually legally required. So the Arizona Supreme Court has ruled that this bill title needs to be a complete description or an index of the substantive law. It may not be deceptive or misleading, and it does not need to be a synopsis, but it has to state the subject of the legislation with sufficient clarity to enable persons reading the title to know what to expect in the body of the act. So you'll see at the bottom, those last few words, this first talks about here which sections we're amending or adding. And then at the end, it talks about appropriating monies and relating to persons with disabilities. So again, all of this language is language that Legislative Council is required to create, but this is the legal language that the Supreme Court would take a look at to see if there were any deceptive items or misleading items that were placed in the bill title that are not in the act, or vice versa. So here's the actual language of House Bill 2388 as it was introduced in the House, and I apologize if it's a little blurry there. So you remember we had our draft that we had worked on as stakeholders. Legislative Council has turned this in to the proper format and has met all the legal requirements for this legislation. So a couple of things that I wanted to point out if you haven't ever really taken a look at a piece of legislation. Legislative Council has created some rules for how we have to write legislation. And so some of that is when you're amending the text. So if you're amending existing law, your new language needs to appear in uppercase. So this language up above in black and lowercase is all current law, already in Arizona state statute. This new language here, number 31, in uppercase and in blue, is new language. Legislative Council also requires that if you're going to change something, that it must appear stricken, and then if you're going to add new language, it's got to appear after the stricken language. So here, this is actually a technical amendment of cleanup to current law. Percent was scratched out, and then the new language is put into place here. So that's how we know what language is being introduced as new. What are we changing in the current state law? What's also interesting to take a look at is we have what's called permanent law and temporary law. And here, you can see in this circle here, 46901, we're adding a new law here in Arizona. It has a statutory reference number, 46901, and we have all this new blue language here and over here. So that's all new language that's being proposed to be added to the Arizona Revised Statutes. Here, if you take a look in this second circle, you see it says Section 6, Annual Report, and there's no statutory number. There's no ARS, this 46908, similar to 901. There's nothing listed here. This is considered temporary law. And what that means is it's literally temporary. So we are asking, in this case, the Department of Economic Security to create reports for a few years. And since that won't last forever in perpetuity, we create this session law or temporary law to direct the agencies to do something, but it won't sit in our statutes. So sometimes there are laws that won't sit on the Arizona Revised Statutes, those legal books, but they have the effect of law, but it's because they're temporary. So the Arizona Constitution requires that to be enacted, a bill must be read by sections on the floor of both the House and the Senate on 3 different days. So you'll hear us talk a lot about the first reading or the third reading or the second reading of the bill. So these formal readings are what trigger separate actions in the progression of a bill or a measure throughout each chamber. So, for example, on the first reading in the House, the measure is then referred, it's given to the chief clerk for printing, and then it's assigned to committees. The speaker then after that will then read the bill a second time, and the speaker can actually read the bill a second time anytime before the committee of the whole, which we'll talk about. In the Senate, however, the bills are traditionally first read, and then they're assigned to one or more standing committees and the Rules Committee, which we'll talk about. And then the bills are generally second read the following day. So both chambers do it a little differently, but both of them have to meet the requirement that the first, the second, and then the third reading, which we'll talk about, will happen. So each chamber has created its own rules, and how they handle their first, second, and third reading individually are set up in those rules. And each new legislature that comes into place can change those rules. So when the new legislators are elected and then come in and are sworn into office in January, as a chamber, there could be changes to the way the House or their Senate does things, and that are changes to their rules. There are abilities in the Arizona Constitution which would allow either the House or the Senate to suspend the requirement of the readings of all 3 readings on 3 separate days. And usually when this happens, both the House and the Senate will do it together, and they'll suspend that requirement. And why they're doing that is usually for an emergency measure, where instead of taking 3 days, because remember it has to be read separately on 3 different days to pass something, they could suspend this requirement and then pass that bill, that measure out in one single day. You see this typically done for special sessions, where the governor calls the legislature into a special session on a particular issue. Most of the time, a special session has been worked out ahead of time, and so they will suspend these requirements in order to get all of their work done in one day. But for the majority of the time, we have to read bills on 3 separate days. So the committee action is what you hear us talk a lot about, and what we ask APAB members a lot of times to sign in for the request to speak system. And the system of the committees and all the different stages that we're talking about are really the different forums for the hearings and for the debate, really in order to allow an opportunity for the entire chamber and for the public to be a part of the consideration of these proposals. So state law authorizes the presiding officer of each legislative chamber, so the president of the Senate or the Speaker of the House, to appoint standing committees. But the state law also provides that either chamber, by resolution or rule, could direct otherwise. So traditionally what happens is that the president and the speaker will determine the number of the committees. They will determine their subject matter jurisdictions at the beginning of each legislative session or term. However, the committees must then be formally established in Senate and House rules, which requires a vote of the majority of the members of each chamber. So while the speaker and the president do generally set the standing committees, and when we talk about standing committees, we're talking about issue area committees. So health, education, appropriations, economic development, whatever it is, they have the prerogative to set those up. But there could be a vote of the chamber in which they would want to change that. I haven't seen it happen anytime recently, but it is a possibility for the legislature to do so. So after the presiding officer, again, the president or the speaker, have referred the bill to one or more committees, then that bill is eligible to be heard in those committees. So every bill is assigned to the Rules Committee, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and then maybe assigned to one or more other standing committees. And once they're assigned, then again, the chairman has the prerogative of whether they would like to be heard. On the House side, they actually assign standing committees in order. There's actually a primary committee. So for example, House Bill 2388 went through the Children and Family Affairs Committee and also through Appropriations. Children and Family Affairs was the primary committee, so it had to be heard in the primary committee first before the Appropriations Committee could hear it. In the Senate, there are not primary committees, so the chairman can hear them in whatever order they would like. They don't have to wait for another committee to hear it. But no matter what, in either chamber, the bill has to go through the standing committees before it goes to the Rules Committee. Excuse me, I'm taking a drink here. So the chairman of the committees set the agenda, and the agendas have different posting requirements depending on whether you're in the Senate or the House. For the House, the agendas must be posted each Wednesday for all of the standing committees that are meeting on Monday of the following week. And they must be posted for Thursday for all of the standing committees meeting any day except Monday of the following week. In the Senate, the agendas must be posted 5 days before the committee meeting. The chairman has the prerogative to put what they want on that agenda, and the committee members cannot take any action on any items unless those items are on that agenda. During the hearing, the committees may take testimony. It is the prerogative of the chairman whether or not testimony is taken. Here in Arizona, it is quite common and usually offered that testimony is taken. It's usually not accepted that the chairman doesn't take testimony. However, chairmen have the prerogative to also limit testimony. And you probably have seen for larger committee hearings where there's a lot of bills or several controversial bills where the chairman have maybe limited testimony to 2 minutes a person, for example, and that's all up to the chairman. But hearing committee, that committee from a subject area perspective is discussing and debating the bill. And so they might hear, again, the testimony, they'll hear a staff report, and they can debate amongst themselves about the bill. They can also offer amendments to the bill. The committee members themselves must sponsor the amendment for it to be offered. So in other words, the membership of that standing committee can offer amendments, but nobody outside of that committee, no other legislator can offer an amendment. Here is also where a request to speak comes into play, where each of the legislators has the request to speak system available to them. They can see who has spoken or who has asked to speak, excuse me, and they can also see who doesn't want to speak but is in favor of the bill. So what we thought we would do here is take a listen. So you're going to see a little blue guy here for a second, excuse me, while we get this moved over. And we're going to watch just a little bit of the hearing for Children and Family Affairs where House Bill 2388 went through.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HB 2388 be returned with due pass certification.
Are they, let's see. Yeah, would you please move the amendment?
Mr. Chair, I move the 9-line amendment in the chair's name dated 1/22/16 be adopted.
Council, please.
Mr. Chair and members, for the record, Mike Hahn, Assistant Analyst with the House Research Staff. The Federal Achieving a Better Life Experience, or ABLE, Act of 2014 created Section 529A in the Internal Revenue Code, which permitted states to establish their own tax advantage savings programs to assist individuals and families in saving private funds for the purpose of supporting individuals with disabilities. House Bill 2388 establishes the Achieving a Better Life Experience, or ABLE program, within DES to be managed by a financial institution chosen by the department. House Bill 2388 also establishes the ABLE Oversight Committee to assist in the implementation, regulation, and oversight of the program. Mr. Chair, there's a proposed amendment, and I'd be happy to explain. The 9-line Allen Amendment, dated 1/22/16, amends sections 3 and 4 of this bill relating to additions and subtractions from Arizona gross income by making these sections retroactive to the tax year beginning from and after December 31st, 2015. The amendment also makes technical changes. And with that, no questions.
Just on the amendment, that's to match up with what the Department of Revenue thinks we should do. And there'll probably be a couple more of these corrections as the bill goes. Thank you. This is my bill, and Representative Brophy McGee worked on this also over the interim. 529 accounts are available for college funds. Most of us who have kids are fairly familiar with the idea that you can put money away, and it's before tax. And when the kid goes to college, you can remove it without tax and pay for college funds. The federal government, through this ABLE Act, and that's why we're calling it the ABLE Act, even though in this state we don't title laws, but it did the ABLE Act, and they opened that up to the developmentally disabled. The programs within their care prescriptions, and it makes it available for either current use or future use. So you can put money in up to $14,000 a year, up to $100,000 a total. Okay, I didn't hear any of that. Okay, Brandy was talking about it, but this is a wonderful opportunity for some families to provide services that aren't provided through their regular care, especially after the parents have passed on or are no longer have the ability to maybe support the child up to the level they used to. So you music therapy or something like that, or travel to a certain place, things that would be available for this extra.
Mr. Chairman, I move that HB 23.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it right there. Give me just a second here. You guys are going to see the little blue guy again. Okay, so what you saw there was the staff member getting up and providing an example, or excuse me, providing an explanation of what the bill did. What you also heard was him talk about an amendment that was offered, and you heard him ask for permission of the chairman to talk about that amendment. And this is the amendment that was offered in committee that I wanted to share with you all today. So a couple of things that are important to note. One, you have here Committee on Children and Family Affairs. So this is the committee that's taking a look at this amendment that was introduced. And here you can see Mr. Allen was the sponsor of this amendment. You'll see that it has a date and a time stamp on it here. That's important for when there are multiple amendments dealing with very similar issues. That helps them to determine what we're talking about, which amendment we're talking about. What you'll also see here then is it says here, page 12, line 19, after the period insert. And you see here, it's blue language, uppercase, right? So this language here is going into the bill, the new language into law, into that permanent law that we talked about. You'll see here, page 19 after line 35, section 10 retroactivity. So this is temporary. Remember, it doesn't have the reference here to the sections. And what this talks about is that this change that we were making in these sections are retroactive to the taxable years beginning from and after December 31st. So basically what this meant was that the bill starts from a tax perspective on January 1, 2016. And this was an amendment that was asked for by the Department of Revenue to make that clarification. So Mr. Allen offered this amendment in committee, And then later on, which we won't be looking at today, but you're welcome to watch the entire hearing if you'd like, that they adopted then and passed the bill. So House Bill 2388 was assigned to both the Children and Family Affairs Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and then the Rules Committee. As I said before, every bill goes through the Rules Committee. And so after the bill passed out of both the Children and Family Affairs and the Appropriations Committee, then it was available for the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is the same in that the chairman sets the agenda for this committee. And so the chairman for the Rules Committee is a very powerful position in both the Senate and the House because of that. Because every bill has to go through the Rules Committee, that means the chairman of these two committees are seeing every single bill. That also means they have the ability to stop every single bill. So when a legislature comes into place and the speaker and the president are chosen, them choosing their rules chairman is a very important part of the decision making that the president and the speaker have to make. So all bills must pass out of the Rules Committee, or they can't move any further, like I talked about. And there's several reasons that the Rules Committee reviews a bill. One is that they determine whether the bill complies with both the United States and the Arizona constitutions. The committee makes sure that the bills are in proper bill drafting format as outlined in the bill drafting manual, and that manual is adopted by Legislative Council. So they're really doing a second check to make sure that the bill's been put in proper form. And then the committee also reviews each bill and any amendments to ensure that they comply with both the Arizona Constitution and the chamber rules, so both the House and the Senate, with respect to germaneness. And germaneness talks about whether each bill contains only one subject and one purpose. So this germaneness requirement prevents some of the log rolling or the Christmas tree making that we hear a lot about in Congress. And in Arizona, that's generally not allowed. This committee can propose amendments, but those amendments are based on technical or corrective considerations. They cannot pass substantive amendments to the idea of the bill. They can only fix issues with constitutionality or proper form or a germaneness issue. Their amendments are recommendations just like any other committee and go to the committee of the whole, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Also, generally, there's no public testimony. The testimony from the rules attorney is generally what is taken, the staff, and there's committee discussion. So in most cases, you won't see anybody testify at the rules committee. For example, APAD wouldn't testify, but you'll see the staff get up and talk to the committee about any concerns they might have with the bill. So we're going to take just a quick look here. And again, forgive me, you're going to see the little blue guy here for a second. At the Rules Committee hearing where House Bill 2388 went through,
all right, Rules Committee is called to order. We will be holding two bills today. We're gonna have fun. We can just hold them all and just pass two bills. See all the people come beating on my door. 2579 and House Bill 2613 will be held. Mr. Vice Chair Pro Tem, would you like to do the mass motion?
Well, I think there's some bills that you're also separately. I should give you the list. She gave you the list. Did you get the list?
I don't know. Separate? Yeah. Okay, we'll hold one.
I can give it to you if you like, or I can just read through the bills without it. But here, separately was 2113, 2219, 2221, 2300, 2340, and 2401. And the other one you're holding anyhow. So
Okay. All right. So we got the.
So this is separate.
Hopefully you all heard the 6. So, did you get those? All right. Mr. Vice Chair Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that House Bill 2018, 2024, 2032, 2043, 2061, 2075, 2103, 2151, 2191, 2197, 2215, 2233, 2239, 2296, 2297, 2301, 2307, 2308, 2312, 2338, 2384, 2387, 2388, 2403, 2427, 2437, 2438, 2442, 2458, 2467, 2479, 2480, 2482, 2497, 2507, 2509, 2535, 2543, 2547, 2550, 2552, 2553, 2555, 2561, 2568, 2572, 2583, 2586, 2594, 2597, 2612, 2614, 2618, 2635, 2637, 2669, 2674, 2676, 2690, 2691, 2692, HCM 2009, HCM 2010, HCR 2016, HCR 2031, HCR 2035, HCR 2039, HCR 2040, HCR 2043, and HR 2002 are constitutional and in proper form.
Thank you. Mr. Norm, you're up.
Mr. Chair, members of committee, if I can make a couple of quick comments about a couple of bills in the mass motion.
No, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Just want to let members know, originally House Bill 2061 dealing with medical marijuana pregnancy exclusion, there were some problems with it.
Okay, so we're gonna stop it right there. Again, you guys are gonna see the little blue guy again here for just a minute as I switch back over. But wanted to talk a little bit about what you heard and saw there. So at the beginning, you heard Mr. Robinson talk about a few bills that they wanted to consider on their own. So he called out 3 or 4 bills that they wanted to consider separately. And then you heard that huge, very long list, right, of bills that he went through. And then his motion for all of those bills was that they were constitutional and in proper form. And so House Bill 2388 was part of that major group list that recommendation went through. And then you saw one of the Rules attorneys get up and begin to provide some information to the Rules Committee on there. After they finished that group motion, then they moved on to separately discussing some of the other bills that the Rules attorneys had questions about. But as you can tell, a very different type of committee from what the little bit we saw in Children and Family Affairs. And that in Children and Family Affairs, we talked about the bill, what was in it, talked about the amendments. In this case, it was only whether or not it met the requirements of the Rules Committee, the constitutionality, that proper form, and its germaneness. So again, Mr. Stevens, in this case, as the Rules Committee Chairman, has the prerogative whether or not any of those bills get on his agenda. And so it makes the Rules Committee a very important committee. So after the Rules Committee, the bills go through caucus. And caucus is the ability, or provides the ability, for the political parties with a forum to discuss and, if possible, achieve party consensus on legislation and various issues such as the state budget. So because right now the Republicans are in the majority, the Republicans set the caucus calendars. So once the bills are out of all of their standing committees, including Rules Committee, they are eligible for caucus, and the majority will set those caucus agendas. The two parties work off of the same agenda. So the Republicans will choose, let's just say, for example, 15 bills that they're going to hear on a given day. The Republicans will meet together separately in a room, and the Democrats will meet in another room separately, but they will all be talking about the same bills. In this case, in a caucus, the legislation is not formally debated, it's not voted on. but the reaction of the caucus members can reveal the level of support or opposition for a measure. This is also the time that the measures may discuss the offering of possible floor amendments and the next step in the committee of the whole. The majority is also the only caucus through its leaders that has the power to impede a bill's progress through caucus. So if, for example, the Republicans meet and they have a lot of questions about a bill and they decide to hold a bill in caucus, that bill does not move any further in the process. However, the Democrats, if they had the same issue but the Republicans didn't, it would still move forward. And that's just, again, because of whoever is in the majority at the time. The two caucuses are open to the public for the most part. There's been a few occasions where they've had closed door caucuses. They're pretty informal. They have staff present and then the members talk about the different bills. They're presided over by the caucus leadership. Here, the legislators do have access also to the request to speak system, so they can take a look at who signed in for the bill, who testified on the bills, and they can see all of the committees. So in this case, with 2388 being assigned to two different committees, they can see the information for both of those committees. So once the bills get out of caucus, then they're ready for what's called the committee of the whole. You hear us refer to this as COW quite a bit. And this is considered a standing committee of all members. So remember, we had a standing committee, an issuary standing committee, for example, Children and Family Affairs, that took a look at the issues. Now we're going to have a committee of the entire body. So this is the first time the entire body of the House or the Senate can actually take a look at the bill and propose amendments if they'd like to. This is also where the entire body gets to also debate the amendments that were adopted in committee or in rules. So you have three types of amendments that all legislators, the Senate or the House separately could be looking at, and those are the committee, standing committees, the rules, committee amendments, and the floor amendments. Here, the request to speak system is also available to the members to see who signed in, who was opposed, who provided any type of comments. The committee of the whole is open to the public, but no testimony is taken. And then the presiding officer of the chamber, so the president or the speaker of the House, will select a chairperson for each COW, and that chairman is chosen out of the body of the membership, so a senator or a representative. And then once COW begins, the bills are discussed along with all of the amendments that are proposed by the committees. And then the amendments, if there are any proposed floor amendments that were not offered in committee but are being offered by a different legislator or from any of the legislators in the body, they take a look at all of those amendments and debate them and could adopt them or kill those amendments here in the committee of the whole. An informal voice vote is taken. This vote is not a recorded vote. However, there are procedural instances where a formal recorded vote could be taken. And then once a bill is favorably reported out of the committee of the whole, it is available for third read. So let's take a look here at committee of the whole for 2388.
Have it so ordered. Clerk will read the next bill on the calendar together with the committee recommendations.
HB 2388. Madam Chair, the committee rules the House President, the Constitution and proper form is amended to pass.
So what you all just heard right there, the gentleman on the far right side was reading the bill. While this is not one of the first, second, or the third readings, that is essentially what we call a reading of the bill, but this one does not count for the third reading.
The chair would love to recognize my seatmate from District 15, Representative Allen, or would somebody like to move his bill? Mr. Whip, would you like to move Mr. Allen's bill?
Madam Chair, I move in the Committee of All Rights report to recommend House Bill 2388 do pass.
Thank you. And would you move the committee amendment?
Yep. Madam Chairman, I move that the committee amendment for CFA be adopted.
Thank you. And would you move the floor amendment to the bill?
Yep, Madam Chair, I move the.
Hold on, pause. We're going to vote on that one. Members, the question before you is the adoption of the committee amendment to House Bill 2388. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say nay. Appears the ayes have it, do have it, so ordered. Would you please move the floor amendment? Or Representative Allen, would you like to move your floor amendment?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I move that my House floor amendment to House Bill 2388 be adopted.
Thank you. Any discussion?
No, ma'am.
Hearing none. Members, the question before you is the adoption of the floor amendment to House Bill 2388. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say nay. It appears the ayes have it, do have it, so ordered. I'll have Representative Allen to move the bill as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rise and report, it recommend that House Bill 2388 as amended be given a due pass recommendation.
Thank you. Any final questions, comments, or discussion? Seeing none. Members, the question before you is that when the Committee of the Whole rises and report, it gives House Bill 2388 as amended a due pass recommendation. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say nay. It appears the ayes have it, do have it, so ordered. Clerk will read the next bill on the calendar together with the committee recommendation.
HB 2550.
Okay, so that was House Bill 2388 going through Committee of the Whole. And luckily, we had done some great work on 2388, but there was no debate and discussion. It makes for a very quick Committee of the Whole. But what you did see there, or hear there, I should say, is a couple of motions were made on the amendments. So you heard them make a motion to adopt the committee amendment. So that was that amendment that we took a look at a few slides ago that was adopted in the Children and Family Affairs Committee. And then you also heard them make a motion to adopt an amendment, a floor amendment, which was Mr. Allen's floor amendment. So there were changes made to House Bill 2388 that were not ready for committee. We worked on them through the process and got them ready for this part of the process in Committee of the Whole. So the committee amendment was adopted, and we also adopted a floor amendment to adopt additional changes. It just so happens in this case that Mr. Allen, the sponsor of the bill, is the one who offered the amendment to the bill, but any legislator could have offered an amendment to this bill, and it would have been discussed, debated, and then they would have made those motions. And again, you also heard the voice vote for the adoption and also for the passage of the bill out of the Committee of the Whole. In most cases, that's how it's done. Again, there are some circumstances where you could have a recorded vote, but most of the time it's by voice vote. So we're done with the Committee of the Whole. What happens in the background is that all of those adopted amendments are incorporated into the bill, and this is known as engrossing. And in the Arizona legislature, they literally reprint the bills when they print them on paper in a goldenrod color for the Senate and green for the House. And so that's another way that you can tell that that bill has been processed through that chamber and is ready for a third read vote. So from this point on, after Committee of the Whole and after the bill has been engrossed, it is considered as a whole. And so any further actions that we take on the bill, it considers the entire package, including all of the amendments. So now we really don't even refer to the amendments any longer. It's now House Bill 2388 as amended. So here you can take a look again on the left-hand side of your screen is the introduced bill. Again, remember it had that short title at the top in red. And here on the right-hand side, if this was printed at the House, it would be in green instead of white, but I pulled this off the internet. And it says House engrossed on the top right-hand side. So we know that now the House has done its work on this bill, and it's available for the House to take to a third read if the presiding officer allows it to do that. So again, third reading is that final vote that needs to take place. We've done those first two readings earlier in the process. So this is that third reading that needs to take place in order to constitutionally allow the bill to move through the process. So each bill is read one last time. Again, you heard the reader read it in committee of the whole, but again, that didn't count because we weren't in third read, but that's essentially what happens in third read. We're going to hear it again here in a second. The formal electronic roll call vote is what is taken here. So this is where you get whether or not it passed out of the chamber. So you need 16 votes in the Senate to get a bill out, and you need 31 votes in the House to get a bill out for most measures. There's a few measures that require additional votes in order to get it out, but for the majority of the time you need 16 and 31. And that 16 and 31 is actually determined on the first day of the legislative session. So no matter who is there for third reading, so we have 60 members in the House of Representatives, and let's say on this day of voting, there are only 55 members. It's not a majority of the 55. It's always a majority of the 60. So you always need the 31. Here in third reading, you're not going to see any debate, but a member can explain their vote one time. And so a lot of times you will hear, while it's not debate, they might be talking to each other through their explanation of their votes. And again, there's no more amendments. We've done all the amendments in the standing committees and in the committee of the whole. And so now we're only looking at the bill as it stands, as amended, and as adopted out of the committee of the whole. So we're going to take a look at this last process. Again, there's my little blue guy for 2388. And this was, again, to get it out of the House of Representatives on third reading.
2388.
House Bill 2388, repealing Section 4105 to Section 30, amending Section 40, incorporating money relating to persons with disabilities.
You've heard the third reading of House Bill 2388. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. Do not vote. Hear the bell. House will now proceed to vote. This is one where I'll ask you, have you all voted? Mr. Allen, how do you vote? And do you want to say something? Thank you. Mr. Bowers? Mr. Farnsworth? Mr. Peterson? Mr. Farnsworth? Okay. Clerk will record the vote. By your vote of 56 ayes, 3 nays, and 1 not voting, you have passed House Bill 2388, signed in open session. The clerk is instructed to record the actions of the House and convey the bill to the Senate. Next bill on the calendar, House Bill 2403.
House Bill 2438.
Okay. So that was passage of 2388 out of the House. As you heard Mr. Robson talk at the end there, he asked for the clerk to record the vote. So again, that was that final roll call vote. He was asking the clerk to record what was on the board and to put it in to the record. And then he also asked the clerk to convey the bill to the Senate. And so now the House is done with its process. And now the Senate needs to go through its process of House Bill 2388 in this case. So we're on to the other chamber. So the House is going to take action on Senate bills. The Senate bill is going to take action on House bills. And once we've done that, the entire process starts over. And in order for a bill to end up at the governor's desk, both chambers, the House and the Senate, have to do a final third read vote on the bill that is exactly the same, down to the periods. And so as we go through this process, we'll talk about what that means. So the Senate is going to take a look at House Bill 2388. The president, which is the presiding officer in the Senate, is going to assign it to committees again. In this case for 2388, it was assigned to Health and Human Services and Appropriations. And then obviously rolls, again, because no matter which chamber we're in, the bill always goes to rules. The bill was discussed in the caucuses again. It went through the committee of the whole. House Bill 2388 was no longer amended, was not amended in the Senate, and then it went through third read. So again, it goes through all the same stages in the other chamber. And then once passed, the opposite chamber returns the bill to the originating body. So in House Bill 2388's case, the Senate returned House Bill 2388 back to the House. And so once the bill is returned from its opposite chamber, the originating chamber, again, in this case, the House, is going to take a look at what the other one did. And again, going back to that fact that the governor has, in order for the bill to go up to the governor, it has to be exactly the same. The House is going to take a look at if the Senate made any changes. In House Bill 2388's case, there were no amendments adopted in the Senate, like I said. And so because of this, the House could forward it on to the governor for consideration. However, had House Bill 2388 been amended in the opposite chamber, the originating chamber gets to decide whether or not they like those changes. So for example, let's say that the Senate had amended House Bill 2388. Mr. Allen, as the main prime sponsor, would have been given the bill back to take a look at and to decide whether he agreed with those changes. If he had agreed, the House would then have had to take another vote, what we call a final read vote, before they could send it to the governor's office. If Mr. Allen hadn't agreed to the changes, then the bill would be taken to what's known as a conference committee to work out the differences. Because conference committees are rare, we're not going to talk about them in too much detail today, but they are essentially small committees of the House and the Senate who meet together at the same time and place to try and work out the differences between the House and the Senate versions. So the Senate and the House, if they have two different versions, this committee is going to work those out and hopefully come out with a compromise. And if they do come out with an agreement, then additional votes are needed. And in some cases, both the House and the Senate have to re-vote the bills again because they might adopt amendments in conference committee to make those agreements work. So unless the bill fails somewhere in the process, so House Bill 2388 could have failed in committee in the House. It could have failed in the committee of the whole in the House. It could have failed in committee in the Senate. It could have failed in the committee of the whole in the Senate. It could have failed in third read in either chamber. But as long as it doesn't fail in either of those, which it did not, then it's on to the governors. So the governor has 5 days while the legislature is in session to act on a bill, and 10 days once the legislature adjourns to act on a bill. And the governor has several different options. They can sign a bill, putting it into law. They can veto a bill, which would not allow the bill to go into law. They can line item veto the bill, and this is only for budget bills where they can strike line item appropriations. Or the governor can actually take no action on a bill and allow the bill go into law without their signature. And you do see this a few times where a governor struggles with a bill and allows it to go into law, but by not putting their signature on it is making a statement about whether or not they were as supportive as others were. A veto of a bill, so if the governor vetoes a bill and doesn't allow it go into law, can be overridden if the bill has what's called a general enactment or a general effective date. You need 2/3 of the legislature, 2/3 of each body in order to override that. And you need 3/4 if it's an emergency or Proposition 108 enactment. And again, those are special bills with special vote requirements. So the Secretary of State, if the governor signs or sends it up without their signature or line items the budget and sends it up, the Secretary of State is the office that actually chapters all enacted bills and creates the legal document that makes it so the laws are changing. So wanted to talk just a quick little bit about the general effective date. Most bills take effect on the general effective date, and what that means is that that bill will take effect on the 91st day that the legislature closes its session. So this goes back to the original language we read in the Constitution. The citizens have a right to approve or reject an act of the legislature. So the citizens can gather signatures to take something that the legislature has done and take it to a vote of the people. So that is the reason that we have a general effective date. We are giving the citizens of Arizona 90 days to see whether or not they like what the legislature has done. And if they don't, they can try to change it by taking it to a vote of the people. The vote doesn't have to happen in those 90 days, but gives them the time to take a look at it and to collect their signatures. So that's why we have a general effective date, and that goes back to that constitutional language that we talked about at the beginning. So this is House Bill 2388. It's chaptered version. So you'll see there's circled here in the middle. This is the chapter number. So this was literally the 214th bill that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor into law. See here the official stamp from the Secretary of State's office. And then what you don't usually see, especially if you look up bills online, is this is all the signature pages that go along with the physical bill as it moves through the process. So you'll see here that it was passed by the House here with 56 votes and 3 nays, and we watched that happen. Speaker Pro Tem Robson was there that day and presiding over the third reading, so that's his signature. And then this is the chief clerk. And then you have here that it passed out of the Senate on this day. President Biggs was presiding, and this is the Secretary of the Senate signature. And then it arrives in the governor's office, and his secretary must sign that they have received it, and that begins the clock for the 5 or the 10 days, depending whether or not we're in session. It's not showing. This isn't showing. Okay. We got technical difficulties here, clearly. Rochelle's letting me know that it's not showing. Let's see. We're going to play with this a little bit. Excuse me here. So, and then you'll also then see when we can get it up, and I apologize for that, that then the governor signs it, which is what put it into law. And hopefully you all can see this. We're going to check on it. Hopefully we've got it up. So you'll see the governor's signature, and then the Secretary of State has to sign it and chapter it. So again, you don't usually see the signature page that comes through, but that's what it does look like, and those are the official signatures that are coming through. So sorry that we couldn't see that at the beginning there. I'm going to give it just a second here so y'all can take a look at that. So again, these are all the official signatures that have to take place in order for the bill to move through the process. So with that, we would be happy to answer any questions about what you heard today. I hope that we've provided you some great background on how a bill becomes law, and appreciate you all being with us today. Are there any other questions that have come up? Rochelle, do you see any?
No questions yet, but there should be a little bit of a delay on that. We'll give it a few minutes here. If anyone has questions, remember, use that chat feature on the main screen that you first saw when you clicked the link on your email. We will take your chat and answer your question accordingly.
And if you think of something later on, feel free to email me. It's brandy@goodmanschwartz.com, BRANDYGOODMANSCHWARTZ.com. Happy to answer any questions if you think of them later on as well.
If you do take a look at the recording, you can ask a question directly from the YouTube page. So if that's something you want to do later to review, feel free to use that question feature as well. Brandy, we have a question that says, the woman that was taking the votes went really fast and she didn't seem to wait for nay votes. Why is that? I think we're talking about Representative Carter and Committee of the Whole.
So if we're talking about Representative Carter and Committee of the Whole, so she was the legislator that the speaker chose to run that Committee of the Whole agenda. And the reason she really wasn't waiting for nays is because she generally knew she didn't have many. Generally speaking, most legislators and the officers kind of have an idea of the bills that are going to be controversial by the time they get to committee of the whole. And the reason for that is because the bills have already gone through potentially 2, but usually 3 committees in the House. So by the time a bill has gone through those 2 or 3 committees, there's a good sense of whether or not we're going to have concern or issues. And so she just happened to know that this one was going to be pretty successful and there weren't going to be any issues. Also, remember, in committee of the whole, we don't take a formal vote. And you can kill a bill in committee of the whole, but it doesn't happen very often. And so generally speaking, we're just worried about the amendments at this time. Good question.
Awesome. Thanks for that question, Deborah. Does anyone else have questions? It can be on anything. It doesn't have to be the process. I guess I should throw in, after 4 years of a political science degree in classes, that legislature and legislative processes in the classroom are sort of taught in a vacuum or a perfect world. And you can sort of see from the video that that's not always the case. When you bring people into the mix, and especially politics, the process is far from perfect. And so we've taught you the process in this video minus the people, human nature, and the politics. And so it's really important to realize that not only was 2388 or the ABLE Act a really easy bill to get through, there wasn't a lot of opposition. And so you saw in the videos that it sort of breezed by without a lot of questions or debate. But you also need to realize that there's a lot going on behind the scenes to make sure that happens. So there was a big coalition that APEB put together, led by our leadership and obviously the wonderful Brandy. And that coalition and Representative Allen and the other sponsors for the bill really helped make that bill a simple one to get through the actual legislative process. Now, for the budget, obviously, you see that there's a lot more controversy. There would be more debate, more questions, and things like cow would last a lot longer. But I did want to just throw out there that when we do these presentations for you, when we go through the legislative process, this isn't a perfect world. And when you get into the videos, if you want to take a look at more, you'll see that there are lots of questions. There are lots of personal issues with legislators and between legislators, and there are politics in the mix. So it's important to understand that during session that this will look the same, but quite different at the same time.
And I see we've got one other question from Deborah on, are the bills read in their whole entirety word for word? So no, back in the day, originally the bills actually used to be read word for word. They didn't necessarily have the ability to print a lot of copies of the bills. And then also there were legislators who couldn't read, and so they would read them word for word. However, today the legal requirement is that you read that legal title that we talked about. And so that's what's read, is the legal title. So the sections that are affected, that language that was in blue on the front page of the bill. So that's all that's read at this time. But you will hear at the very beginning of session, when a legislature comes into session, so in January, there will be a motion that's made on the first day about suspending the requirement and only reading the bill's title. And so they do have to make that motion to make that happen throughout the legislative session. Another good question. Thank you.
Awesome. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions popping up, but again, if you think of those, be sure to email Brandy or use that question feature on the replay on YouTube. We're going to be sending out information on the upcoming webinars very soon, so keep your eye out for that. And thank you so much for joining us and sticking with us the entire time. The replay should be up shortly after we end the broadcast. All right, everybody have a great day. We will see you on October 19th for the next webinar in the series.
Thank you all very much.